Welcome to the Integration Station. I'm your host, Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me today is no one. I'm by myself today. Eleanor is off-site, so I will be taking you on a journey of discovery about how to communicate with neurodivergent youth, and in particular, working with high needs youth who may have difficulties with communication. For those who are friends of the podcast, listen regularly, we have a Q&A format, so if you do have any questions, please shoot those through to podcast@otfcgroup.au. That's our email. Otherwise, we have an Instagram handle, which is OTFC Group. Otherwise, we are on the TikToks for those who do prefer to send questions that way. We've got some great ones recently. We're back on those socials, so we'll do some quick fire answers for any individuals who want to shoot through some questions there. If you enjoy our podcast, please share it with anybody that you think would benefit from it, which should be everyone. We have listeners all over the world. I've got some emails from some friends in France, questions from Canada, just to name a few. So anybody that does have questions, as mentioned before, send those through and we'll aim to answer those when we can. So the more you share, the more the word of OT is spread. And for those students out there who are just picking up and learning things, or even new graduates, we certainly hope that our podcast is a bit of PD in your pocket. Today I'll be talking about communicating with neurodivergent youth, and in particular, communicating with young people with high needs. These could be young people who are non-speaking, have difficulties with receptive and expressive language. I was fortunate enough to be able to speak at a medical students conference last year, and along with some other excellent speakers about communicating with different patients, I was able to draw on my experience of working with young people for a number of years in how best to support that interaction and that communication. Now, I will start by saying this is not a comprehensive approach, but I have 10 to 12 key points here that I think will certainly help start anybody's journey in being more confident about how to communicate with a variety of people they come across. So first point, the double empathy problem. Listeners of the show would have certainly remembered back in our Neurodiversity Month earlier this year, we talked about the double empathy problem. This comes from Damien Milton, and it essentially talks around the difference in the experience and interaction that a neurodivergent person may have to a neurotypical person. For so many years, the experience of a neurodivergent person has not truly been understood and has certainly isolated them from the world around them. The double empathy problem provides the insight into one person's experience may be different to another's, and in particular when a neurodivergent person may be trying to understand something, experience the world in their way, that may be different to a neurotypical person. So managing your expectations. This is not just on the other person. A neurodivergent person is not purely the only individual here in communicating. How you get your point across comes a lot down to you as, if you're a neurotypical person, a practitioner, ensuring that there is a balance and you're able to meet halfway, listening and respecting the other person's views, and the importance of that. I say this is point number one because if you can understand that, you're probably a quarter of a way there in being able to develop a level of trust and understanding for that other individual you're working with. The second point I make is clear is kind. Less words, slightly reduced rate of speech, yes/no responses, they can all help build clarity in what you're trying to say. For example, if I'm saying a much longer sentence with many, many words, that's a lot for the other person to process. If I said, would you like to sit on the bed, yes or no? Yes, it's a question, but you're giving a yes/no response. And those yes/no responses can be quite useful because a lot of people can give a yes or no response. Whilst that's not always the case, it's always important that you make sure your point is clear, you're outlining exactly what you are doing and explaining it in easy to understand terms. When I think about my own experience or my experience of going to medical appointments with my son, the best clinicians are the ones who are able to outline what is happening, explain it in clear terms, and provide it in a way that is easy for a young person to understand. Again, that reduced rate of speech does not mean talking at a very slow rate like this. Some people like a 0.5 speed when they're watching something, but if we're able to communicate in a way that is respectful but slower and clearer, That's going to help everybody. The easy example I can think of is at times when we are overseas or we're traveling and we're speaking to an individual from another country. Often we try and reduce our rate of speech so significantly for others to understand. This can be effective, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on how we can get our point across in a much clearer way without having to completely reduce our rate of speech. So just being considerate of managing how we speak and finding that right balance. The next point then is to talk to the individual. At times you might have someone come in who has reduced language, who has difficulties communicating, but does not mean that they are not the first person you're talking to. So often in assessments, I'm very conscious of how much information I do provide and how much I do talk, but I'm also very aware of any time I raise something, I'm always addressing the young person in question first, and also, where needed, talking with a caregiver to assist if there are difficulties with communication or understanding. What we've heard for many years is that for a lot of neurodivergent people, they often haven't been spoken to first. This is quite alienating. This isolates a lot of people in this situation and feels as though they're not valued in that moment. The worst thing we can do is devalue an individual, particularly when you're in a clinical situation. Again, talking with that tone of voice, your normal tone of voice, not changing it to as if you were talking to a child. I often give this feedback when it's working with new graduates or other people who have not been exposed to working with those with difficulties with verbal communication. And that feedback is to ensure you can still talk in your normal tone of voice with adjustments, but not as if you were talking to a baby or a young child. Point number 5, I think if my math is correct, is same, not different. So if I have given an instruction, a direction, or a piece of information, then one of the most unhelpful things is to reword, change, or get your point across in another way, because what you're doing there is changing the information you gave the first time and adding a second lot of information to have to process. The best thing to do is repeat what you've just said, try and make that a little bit slower, and maybe reduce a couple of words in there, but have the same message get across. This can ensure that there is a greater chance of that other person understanding what is being said, or if it's still not quite understood, that a caregiver or another person is able to help support. The next point would be sometimes that information may be harder to understand because there may be processing time. I often think of this as that loading screen or that buffering screen you may see on any of the streaming services when the internet's down or something's not quite working. This processing time is really important. It allows an individual an opportunity to listen, to take in the information, to try and perceive what is being said, and then to enact a response. So sometimes there might be silences or pauses. Being comfortable with that, that's an opportunity for that person to process what is being said. So often in my work, I have delivered information, waited for a few seconds, sometimes 5 to 10 seconds, as that person is slowly processing what is being asked of them. Ensuring you allow for that processing time can certainly help in delivering your message and giving that person the autonomy to understand what you have actually asked. There's nothing more polarizing than shooting out a whole bunch of medical terms to someone. I know we've all been there, and I know we've all been in situations where we have consulted with, whether it's a medical practitioner or an expert in the field who is using a lot of key terms and medical terms that they are familiar with, but that you as an individual find quite hard to understand. The best thing we can do is avoid too many medical terms, use them when needed, but be able to explain them in more layman's terms. A good professional can explain the complex simply, and I think this is really pertinent here because when we're working with neurodivergent young people, and in particular those with higher needs where language is a significant challenge, using lots of complex terms that might not be understood will only make it harder for him to understand what's going on. Using real-world examples or analogies can certainly deliver a clearer message and provide a level of understanding for that other person. For example, when we talk about modulation in our podcasts or even in our assessments, we talk about it from the perspective of a volume dial, whether the volume dial is up too loud or too little. Our sensory world is unpredictable. And for a lot of people, they want to control this by having a volume dial to control whether it's the amount of noise, the amount of touch, the amount of smell or sight in their environment. We use that analogy as a way to help explain that sometimes the sensory world can be overwhelming. The volume dial helps us control that, and that's our sensory modulation systems at work. Another point is that communication, a lot of it, is in nonverbal forms. So much of our communication comes in hand gestures, body language, how we position ourselves, whether our arms are crossed, how our face looks. Gestures and facial expressions can support a person's level of trust or can make someone feel unsafe around that person. You need to explore what works best for you, but I think it's important that anybody working with neurodivergent youth, whether you're a practitioner or not, understands the importance of how you present yourself, whether it's your facial expressions or body language, and how this can support a person's level of trust. Where you can use non-verbal cues, this could be pictures, gestures. For a lot of our young people who have difficulties with verbal communication, they may also have a technological device to support communication. Utilizing that technology to assist with getting information across or for them to be able to respond. When it comes to body language, I often find that slow and predictable movement is important. Sometimes you'll meet a person who can be extremely energetic, bouncing off the walls, moving all over the place. Sometimes it's okay to match that energy, but a lot of the time in a clinical setting, whether it's in therapy or say in a medical situation, that being able to adjust your body to slow and predictable movements can really help reduce that high arousal level and create a sense of predictability in yourself. Do not be scared or overwhelmed by those busier clients as well. Sometimes I see that when someone can present as quite busy, that can increase the arousal level of another person and make them feel a bit overwhelmed and anxious. The more controlled and predictable your movements are, sometimes being lower to the ground, presenting as a safe and trusting person can be a great way to present as a predictable individual in what can be an unpredictable space. Another point is declarative versus imperative language. We've talked about this in previous podcasts, and it's certainly a good strategy when working with clients with a PDA profile or the pathological demand avoidance profile. For a lot of these clients, there is a sense of autonomy that they're seeking, and coming to a medical appointment, a therapy session, or something outside their comfort zone can be extremely anxiety-provoking. Demands and directions can be extremely overwhelming and can often lead to a shutdown response or increased dysregulation. So if you're in a position where you're working with a young person, whether it's an assessment, a session, or say you're a medical practitioner working in a hospital or clinic setting, you may want to take a blood sample. You may want them to sit on a bed. You may want them to do something. The way we say it is really important. For example, if you need them to take their shoes off, rather than saying, can you take your shoes off? It could be, we don't need your shoes on for this activity. Or, I notice your shoes are on your feet. They can go on the ground. This way, instead of telling them something, you're observing and noticing something, and this can certainly help reduce the demands of the task. And whilst it's not the case for all clients, it is something that can be quite useful to have in your toolkit. The one thing I've found over many years is that neurodivergent youth have an excellent bullshit detector. And this brings me to my next point. Don't fake it. If you're not sure, say you're not sure. Be genuine, be upfront and be honest. They're going to be honest. Those that can communicate verbally and are able to give you their insight and their opinion, they'll be able to tell if you are doing this for your interests or for their best interests. Working with them comes back to that double empathy problem. If we're able to understand their point of view, listen first, then have your opinion, that can go a long way to supporting a sense of trust. Those body signals, those non-threatening faces, whether it's a smile or whether it's reducing eye contact because that's something that they find challenging, that can all help build a sense of trust. And being able to communicate what you want clearly in an empathetic and kind manner will ensure that trust is slowly built over time. A couple more points here. One is exposed retreat. This is something that our national director, Dino, talks a lot about, and certainly taught me in my early days working as an OT. And that was presenting something, leaving it there, stepping back and giving time for that person to take everything in. It could be presenting an instruction, presenting something that they need to do, taking a step back, giving them time to process what's in front of them, and allowing them the opportunity to interact with something. So, for example, if it's in a session or if it's in a clinic setting, you might be presenting them with something you need them to hold, or you might need them to squeeze something or do something medically. If you allow them time to process that, then that's going to give them a greater chance of being able to feel comfortable with the environment. For example, it could be if they're having an ultrasound, allowing them to feel the device, feel the gel, have an opportunity to be exposed to the space, the chair, and the equipment in a way that allows them to feel comfortable with what's being presented. If it's in the therapy space, setting up an activity and then taking a step back, not forcing anything, allowing them time to process and take in the information. Give them time to take it all in and step in when they seem comfortable. And I guess the final point is for a lot of neurodivergent youth, and in particular clients with high needs, those who may have difficulties with verbal expression, anxiety is significant. When we think about going to a new space, whether it's a hospital, a medical facility, a clinic session, a therapy space, the level of anxiety can be quite high. Sometimes for a lot of these people, they don't actually want to be there. They're not sure what's going to happen and they're not feeling comfortable. The number one rule for me is be punctual. Be on time, get out when you can. The longer that person's sitting there waiting, the greater their anxiety builds. I think of it as when you're waiting to be picked up I think of the example of when you're waiting to be picked up by a friend and you're watching out the window, waiting for this person, hoping that the longer you wait and watch, the faster they'll come. That anticipation, that anxiety is building. It's a lot of unpredictability. And whilst for a lot of neurotypical people, they can manage that emotion, for a lot of our neurodivergent youth, particularly those with difficulties with verbal communication, this can be extremely overwhelming. The one thing I'd say is patience is key. Sometimes when you do have neurodivergent youth who are able to express themselves verbally, you might get blunt or facetious responses. Take that on board, deflect, and be able to maintain that trusting, safe person, regardless of what you might get back. As I mentioned before, don't fake it, but also don't become defensive. Remember, a person's response may just be a reflection of their heightened anxiety. It's not always a reflection of you. And in particular, if you've adopted a number of these strategies, you may get a much different response from the individual. I think in summarizing, whilst there are a number of key points here that I've mentioned, these are all a starting point. And as we've said in many episodes before, once you know one person with autism or one neurodivergent individual, you know one neurodivergent individual. And everybody is different. And so being able to provide a safe environment is the first way to develop a positive relationship. Sometimes these relationships are only short, whether it's a medical appointment, an assessment. You may only see these people a few times or even once. If you're able to adopt certain principles and strategies in that first instance, then you've got a better chance of being able to get the information out that you want in an effective way. For those where communication is extremely challenging and you're able to use other forms of communication, be it non-verbal or technology or any sort of visuals, then utilize what you have on hand. There's nothing wrong with singing a song or moving your body around to get your point across, and any way to ensure that person feels safe and willing to come back is the best way to support those clients. So that's a short summary of some of the key points that I would be implementing to start when working with neurodivergent youth, and in particular those who are non-speaking or have difficulties with expressive and receptive language. Now, I'm not a speech therapist, but having worked with a number of these young people over the years, there is a lot of non-verbals that are important here. And when we think about those strategies and what we've discussed, there's a lot that even if you're not a practitioner, if you're a parent, caregiver, or someone working with a neurodivergent young person, you can take on board. If you've liked what we've talked about today, feel free to send through any questions, comments, or feedback through to our email address, podcast@otfcgroup.au. Otherwise, through our socials on Instagram, OTFC Group is our handle. I hope that this has provided a bit of insight and a bit more PD in your pocket. And as always, before we finish up, just do a quick shout out to Fletch. Hope you're having a good time, mate. And hopefully we'll see you next week with my co-host Eleanor.